Thank you, councillors. Those who are here. Can I take the opportunity to welcome everyone here this evening? Thank you for attending tonight's council meeting. It has approached 7 o'clock, our commencement hour. We do have a quorum, so we will commence tonight's meeting. Copies of the agenda have been circulated. They're on the seats. Please take one. And if there's not to go around, can I encourage you to share one, and they're also online should you wish to use your laptops. Can I also ask, if you do have your mobile phones, could you please put them on silent or switch them off? And you can leave at your leisure during the course of the evening, but if you are leaving, can you do so quietly? Thank you. We'll commence tonight's meeting now, and the membership is as listed. We have no apologies, apart from Councillor Greco, who has had leave approved, so his approved leave of absence has been noted. The other councillors aren't here this evening, but they're on their way. Next item is item 3, disclosures of conflicts of interest. Are there any conflicts of interest from councillors?
No, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you. Item 4, confirmation of the minutes of the previous council meetings. Move Councillor Williams, second Councillor McCarthy. I'll put that to a vote. All those in favour? That's carried. Thank you. We now go to item 5, public question time. And we've had a few questions lodged online, so I'll read those out and I'll provide written responses from officers. First question is from Nathaniel Ram from Thornbury. Question is, will the council commit to restoring the lights along Bracken Avenue in Thornbury between Miller and 5 Streets as soon as possible? I beg your pardon, we have 2 meetings that we need to actually move. There was a special council meeting from the 27th to 28th of June. We need someone to move that. Councillor McCarthy, Councillor Lee has seconded. I'll put that to a vote. All those in favour. And for the latecomers who have attended, are there any conflicts of interest? No. Councillor Blower? No, thank you. Go back to question time now. Question from Nathaniel Rand. Question from he is, will the council commit to restoring the lights along Bracken Avenue in Thornbury between Miller and 5 Streets as soon as possible? 6 consecutive light towers have been out of operation for over a year. The stretch is extremely dark at night and the terrain very uneven, winding and dangerous in the dark. It would appear the towers merely need replacement light bulbs. Our response from the officer is, council is committed to renewing the lighting infrastructure along Bracken Avenue. When the lights were reported as faulty, our electrician found the cause was not as simple as replacing the light bulbs. The solar power lighting installation is almost 20 years old, and in that time the surrounding trees have grown significantly, blocking the solar panels' ability to recharge the batteries during the day. Due to the difficulties in getting solar to work in this environment, council has been working towards a mains-powered solution, which was delayed whilst we waited on City Power to supply us with a connection point. City Power's approval was provided last week, and it is our intention to deliver lighting to Bracken Avenue as soon as possible. Nathaniel will be providing a written response to that question as well. We have a question, several questions here. I'll read the first 2 that have been provided as per our local law from Serena O'Malley from Reservoir. Question 1. With reference to the special council meeting minutes on the 27th of June 2016, minute number 266, can you confirm that council is still negotiating a sale price with the state government for the whole of the former Ruthven Primary School site and 1.8 hectares of land adjoining the Merry Creek at the former Lakeside Secondary College? The response at this stage is council still negotiating with the Victorian Government for the sites in question. Question 2. Have many face-to-face negotiating sessions taken place with representatives of the state government since the council meeting of the 6th of June 2016, when the decision was made to purchase both parcels of land? Have elected councils been provided with any in-principle negotiated agreement relating to these land sales? Answers from the officer at this stage are 2A, the first part. Negotiations including face-to-face discussions are underway and negotiations will remain confidential until a decision is reached. And the other part to that question, the answer is negotiations with the Victorian Government have not yet reached the point of agreement. There are other questions here. We'll attempt to address those in a written response as well. Question from Terry Mason from Reservoir. 2 questions from he. First question in relation to this question is in relation to the intended purchase of a land at the former Ruthven Primary School and 1.8 hectares of land adjoining the Merry Creek at the former Lakeside Secondary College. First question, knowing that the state government must undertake a valuation of the land before it can be sold to Darebin Council, has council been provided with a new general valuation for the land? If so, how much is it? If not, can you explain the delay? Second question is, as this valuation is likely to be contingent on the zoning of the land, can you tell me what the zoning will be for the purpose of the valuation for each site? Very good question. First part of the answer is, council has not received a current market valuation for the land. The Victorian Government uses valuations provided through the Officer of the Valuer General. These valuations are usually completed by a contracted valuation company, and we are told can take between 4 to 6 weeks to complete. And the second part, the Victorian Government would be responsible for issuing instructions to the Valuer General, which would include the zoning of the land to be used to determine the land's value. We'll provide a written response to those questions to Terry as well. Another set of questions lodged this evening from Jeffrey Richards from Northcote, and a little preamble, so I'll just mention this. I refer to a previous part answered question of February the 15th, 2016. The first portion of that question raised concern over a fallen tree branch across the perimeter fence between Veronica Gardens Retirement Village and the Northcote Golf Course, the latter being council-owned property. I thank council for its office and its officers for prompt attention to the same. However, we appear not to have reached a reply to our second concern, which related to nearby tall, well-developed trees. Although their growth is applauded, some branches may be in danger of falling. Indeed, there is evidence of this happening where broken branches could be seen lying on the ground. One tree in particular is close to the village fence line and the adjacent interior walkway. Our response is, council officers will inspect the trees concerned as soon as possible and arrange appropriate remedial action as required. A report will be provided to Mr Richards on the state of the trees. So thank the members of the committee for those questions. More detailed responses will be provided in written form. And can also inform members of the gallery that at the next council meeting on the 18th of July, question time will be delivered from the gallery itself. We'll also request, if you do want to lodge questions online, you're more than happy to do so. We've notified the Minister of our intention to actually consider questions from the gallery, but there'll be conditions as to how those questions will be asked, but more importantly addressed as well. So just let people know if you're intending to attend the next meeting on the 18th. That concludes our question time. We now go to consideration of reports, commencing with 6.1, the Darebin Leisure Strategy Action Plan for 2015-20 Annual Implementation Update. We have a recommendation there from councillors. Anyone to move that?
Happy to move that.
Councillor Lee has moved. Councillor Walsh has seconded. Councillor Lee.
Thank you very much, Mr Mayor. This is a noting of the report of the Council's progress against this adopted leisure strategy. For those in the audience that want to know more about it, you'll find it in the actual report and it's an attachment. Just very briefly, the report seeks to, the strategy rather, seeks to increase female participation in sport and as well as making sport and passive recreation more available and accessible by residents of Darebin. We are pleased to see that there has been an increase in uptake of women participation in sport, particularly in codes such as AFL football through the Darebin Falcons, and also the first women's cricket cup that was held in the summer of early this year. We've also seen an increase in the number of outdoor exercise equipment that's been placed in the city of Darebin, and also worthy of note is the $346,000 that council's managed to attract in the funding from the Sports and Recreation Victoria. There are obviously some major work still needs to be done, most notable of which is the joint facility, John Cain Reserve, and I know that there's a lot of interest in the community about that in order to increase girls' access to sport, in particular basketball and netball and a range of other indoor sports, and hopefully we will be hearing some positive news soon. I think the residents of Darebin are deserving to receive some funding in relation to the indoor multi-sport stadium. I'll leave it at that. Others.
Thank you, Councillor Lee. Councillor Walsh is seconded. You want to speak first?
I will. I'm going to speak on this. But one thing I would want to say is, and I raised this with the relevant officer before, but I think that this comes at a welcome time, and I guess I'm confused about the idea of because at the moment, councillors and community, and Mr Mayor, we've got obviously there's quite a bit in this space in the wider scene in terms of the women's draft, the women's AFL draft. And the reason why I mentioned that is because, of course, I don't have the exact numbers on me, but a huge proportion of the women who are going to be drafted in the women's draft actually come from the Darebin Falcons, and so I've kind of been thinking, well, you could kind of use that and kind of piggyback onto that, and as a way to promote women's sport in Darebin. That was, I guess that's kind of my point, Mr. Mayor, and I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Councillor Walsh. Councillor Barlow.
Just a question, Mr. Mayor, if I may, and it's, I suppose, through you to one of the officers. It's just in relation to the commitment in the strategy where we say that we'll have leisure services will achieve a minimum of 2 pavilion redevelopments and 2 sport field lighting and 2 sport field safety fencing projects per year until 2020. I'm just wondering whether any consideration has been given to the impact of rate capping in future budgets. I mean, and the language that we have here is will achieve, and I'm just concerned that there will be, you know, quite significant structural changes to budgeting when in the next budget. This year, I know everything we kept everything as is, but in the subsequent years, there might be other strategic decisions made on where the next council invests money, and I'm just wondering, how does this sit within some of those issues that are now a bit of an unknown, and the only known that we know is that we do have rate capping and it will have an impact.
Mr. CEO.
Yeah, Mr. Mayor, that's a pretty good question, I should say, because rate capping works have been, we have started, but on the stage 1 only. Yes, definitely some of these strategies and the services need to be looked at, unless state and federal increase their funding for sports, like they used to do that. And at the moment they don't pay for these things.
Yes.
So, unless it's a election promise. So definitely we'll bring it to the council. It will be part of the next council plan as well.
Yeah, that's right.
There'll be a review.
Okay, thank you for that.
Thank
Any
you,
further
Mr.
comments? If not, we have had a move and a seconder. I'll put that to a vote. All those in favour? That's carried. Thank you, councillors. Next item is 6.2, the Darebin Child Friendly City Framework. Move, Councillor Setis. The seconder.
I'll second it, but I've got
Councillor McCarthy.
I think Councillor Williams was going to move it originally. I had briefed her on some words, so apologies to Councillor Setis for hearing this first. It's just to point to, after the word council, instead of at 12 months, to replace those words with at the start of the next council term.
Move is happy with that, and the minute taker has been made aware to amend that at commencement of the next council term, yes?
That's correct.
Okay, yep. Happy with that? And Councillor McCarthy, seconder. Yes.
I am, didn't catch the cross-referencing from before, Mr Mayor. But for a number of years, councillors will be aware the council has invested in its time and space in this area for a number of years. And I suppose just as terms of reference for a physical perspective, you only have to go to Keon Park Children's Community Hub to see a practical demonstration. In fact, the centre was built before the strategy and, of course, the strategic resource plan to support it, Mr Mayor. So we've done some great work. The response to demand management, if I can use that terminology, has been one of the increasing tests of this council, whether it's from the south of the city in terms of the spike of birth rates or indeed through Preston and Reservoir. So I think the council as a whole, when we look at the historical connection, and Councillor McCarthy would be aware of this because I think we co-sponsored the motion back as far back as 2009 or 2010, correct me if I'm wrong, in terms of supporting the inclusion of a portable, a demountable to move from place to place to actually meet that demand where those spikes caught us off guard. So of course, council has shown its nimbleness in this space, but if you read the appendix to this, it sounds like a feel-good story, but I get the sense that it's more a statement of strategic intent to later on build upon that in terms of dollars and cents. And it's absent from this, and you'll appreciate even with Councillor McCarthy's inclusion of the point 2, that would rightly rest with the new council in terms of forward mapping over the forward estimates in terms of how much money would be allocated to actually give practical effect to that. So whether that's the integration of ICT services connecting through our services in this space throughout the whole city, or in fact in terms of actual physical play spaces. So money is associated with that. The quantum, of course, will be spelt out to the new council in terms of how much that might be over the next 4 years. But I can assure you, if you look at the retrospective in terms of what we've done, 5 million just in Keelan Park Community Hub alone actually speaks volumes in terms of the I suppose, fair incomeness of this council in terms of getting on with the job. The reality is that, the call for additional spaces, as it's called for in the appendix, is actually recognition of the fact that we are from time to time having to address these spikes. And I'm aware of the fact that that's had a domino effect when we look at primary schools that have closed down, or indeed Preston Girls High School. So, governments have been caught out trying to, I suppose, pluck the low-hanging fruit in terms of making a yield to the bottom line of the budget, but addressing the social side of the equation of what to do with people's demands in the education side eventually catch up with them, because it's a generational thing. I saw that even with my own children, Mr Mayor, at Westgarth Primary School. There they were at sub 300 students when my boy went there first, and looking at closing. And now it's spiked above 600, and they had to put a cap on the place, and indeed a zone around there to ensure that it didn't grow any further. So we're aware of that. We want to recognise the work that we're doing, but we need the partnership with the state government, of course, because they have prime responsibility in this area. And if I look towards the support the state government gave us back then, 1.5 million to the contribution of Keelan Park Community Hub, we have runs on the board in terms of our work and the cooperation with multiple levels of government to actually make such a plan come to reality. And I'll leave it at that.
Thank you, Councillor Seeders. Councillor McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr Mayor, and hopefully Councillor Williams will also speak on this as well, because we've both had the pleasure in the last, I know the last couple of years, and going back before that as well, I know Councillor Seeders was involved in the committee. Of course, the Child Friendly Cities Committee is part of an initiative which we kicked off in this term, but it follows a lot of work around obviously thinking about the environment and the spaces that we create for young people and for children in our city. This really takes us to that final point in terms of actually having a policy setting or a framework for making this a child-friendly city. And we might say that we have achieved some aspects of that, but there's always a lot more that we can do. The Child-Friendly Cities initiative is actually a global initiative, and it has been driven by some work at the VLGA, the Victorian Local Governance Association. There are a couple of cities that have gone several steps ahead in terms of their community engagement about what a child-friendly city looks like. We as a council have taken the view that we need some really great stakeholder involvement to get a sense of what for us a child-friendly city looks like beyond just the symbolism, and that's where what we have here is a framework and action plans which actually drive changes to our services where possible to make them as inclusive as possible for children, but also a framework through which ideally every council decision is looked through, a lens in a way. And that's not just in the obvious areas like play spaces where we tend to think about a lot of children's activity or maternal and child health services, but also our public spaces, thinking about the accessibility of our public spaces to children, how we as a council continue to build and refurbish our buildings, think about the children's scale, not just the human scale. So there's huge impacts as a result of this, potentially, in terms of our physical infrastructure, but also in terms of how we involve young people and children in our decision making. And I note that whilst we have a youth council, there are very few avenues for children to actually have that input. So this provides some platforms for us to do that. I'll just make one point as well. We want to keep this on the next council's agenda. So hence getting a report straight away.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Williams, do you want to speak too?
Yes, please. It's been a great honour to be on this committee. It does great work. There's probably one place that a child will not feel bullied, and it's probably in the playground. And the playground is a place where no matter what culture, background or religion you come from, and it's important that we do have this framework implemented and that we still continue working towards the rights of the children for our local communities in the partnership with the children. It's also having this child-friendly city is initiatives too, aims to improve the lives of the children in the region and recognising the realisation of their rights and creating sustainable environments for them today and the future generation. also the committee will also look at the future in looking at mapping out where there is actually gaps and where we can identify those gaps and have opportunities in showcasing for current children-friendly practices for the future. So it's an important role because this is our future generation that we're looking at and we need to consider them, and they are part of our community and they need to have a voice.
Thank you very much, Councillor Williams. If there's no further discussion, I'll put that to a vote. All those in favour? That item is carried. Thank you, councillors. Next item is 6.3, Council support to Safe Schools
Happy to
Coalition
second
members
it,
in
Mr.
Darwin.
Mayor.
Mr. Mayor.
Move Councillor Lee, second Councillor Villela. Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Mayor, and thank you, Councillor Villela. This is the report that was left over from an item of business we dealt back in March this year when the Darebin Council signed up as a supporter of the Safe Schools Coalition. And at that time, we also wrote to the Prime Minister urging him to review the situation, but also write to the Victorian Premier congratulating him on his stance on picking up the funding for the Safe Schools program post the cessation of the Commonwealth funding in 2017. So this report highlights a number of issues that we can deal with, and I thank the officers for consulting extensively with our local schools and community on this. The framework that we adopted are entirely consistent with Council's adopted values and policies in the LGBTI space, and in fact we are one of the very first councils to adopt a same-sex and gender diverse committee. So we are very progressive in that area, but at a local level, if you turn to page 16 of the report, you'll note that there are 7 schools that are members of the Safe Schools Coalition and 1 which became a supporter of the Safe Schools Coalition. So there is a need in the community to have this program valued and also supported. What the report recommends is that we do need to increase our council advocacy representation and presence at some of those events, and I think that is something that we as elected representative of the community need to do more often. Also, there are some comments being made about the need for tackle gender bias in some of the discussions and violence against women that's coming through as well. Obviously, these issues will be dealt with in other aspects of Council's advisory committees. On a final note, I do note that the outcome of the federal election is somewhat unclear. However, that issue dominated the election, as we all know. Depending on who forms government, we either have the legislation to recognise marriage equality in the first 100 days of sitting, or we're going to have a $160 million plebiscite on this issue, which is non-binding to the MPs. So, no doubt, even when the new government forms, there will be some flowing effect to the LGBTIQ community here in Darebin, and even when that happens, I'm sure we're more than capable of dealing with some of the consequences of that and finding out the best ways we can support people in our community on those particular issues. Thank you, Mr. Mayor.
Thank you very much, Councillor Lee. Councillor Villela, anything to add?
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and I also welcome, I just want to congratulate and thank Councillor Lee for actually proposing this as a notice of motion when we were informed that the federal government was going to review the content of the program, but then luckily the state government came in and saved the day. So as a consequence, because the state government did fill that gap or responded appropriately, with the schools that were consulted in response to Councillor Lee's notice of motion, the feedback was that everything's okay. We've got the state funding. The state's going to continue it, but we really appreciate council's support. And I think and they did ask for maybe some ad hoc financial assistance with maybe some materials. But so I think what that highlights to me, Mr. Mayor, is because there was some discussion in the council about whether this is a federal issue, a state issue, and we argued quite strenuously in the chamber that this is very much a local issue, and it's an important space for local government. Because the message that was sent out to the community, Mr. Mayor, is that Darebin City Council supports, advocates, and values diversity, and that everyone in our community has the right to those basic human rights. And I think that is where we play a very important role. I also want to note, Mr Mayor, that the schools that are members are state schools, but we have very diverse schools in this community, and they, you know, they have that autonomy. But it's important that as a community, as a council, we talk on behalf of all of Darebin. Thank you, Mr Mayor.
Thank you, Councillor Blunt. Any other speakers? Councillor Walsh.
I like to speak against this. I'm not going to say too much, but you know, I said it at the time. I don't think it's council's role and responsibility to get involved in this space. I support anti-bullying programs. I do think that there were some concerns which were valid about the Safe Schools Coalition, but I don't think we should be getting involved in this space at all.
Okay, thank you, Councillor Walsh. Councillor McCarthy.
Councillor Walsh's opposition has compelled me to actually speak in favour of this. I wasn't going to because it was implicit my support for this, and I would acknowledge Councillor Lee's initiative in raising the original motion, but I think we need to set the record straight here in relation to the actual data and information of the Safe Schools Coalition and the state and the federal government review into this program itself, which acknowledged that there are very few instances around the country of any parental concern about this program, and that when people have the time to understand what the program is about, it's not about indoctrinating young people. It's not about forcing children to experiment with different lifestyles. It's about creating positive social norms about young people, about different types of families. And I would make the point, we are in the city of Darebin.
Yeah, but surely,
Councillor Walsh. Councillor Walsh. Thank you,
we have one of the highest reported and self-reported populations of rainbow families, of LGBTIQ young people self-identifying in schools. We have, at a national level, more schools being part of this program than any municipality in the country, and we are in a unique position to show local leadership and stand alongside our schools and our parents and our students and our community in solidarity, but also in cases like this, as I think Councillor Lee rightly took the move, to make a statement and say we as a city are not going to stand idly by whilst bullying occurs in the school ground, or bullying of a program designed to tackle bullying is bullied by a government. And I think that, you know, there are very few cases where I would like to think we all line up, and I'd like to think this is one of those.
Thank you, Councillor.
And I'll end it there. Thank you.
Councillor. Councillor Lee, you can close the debate if you like.
Look, just very briefly, you know, obviously my stance are consistent on this issue, as is that of Councillor Walsh. So we'll leave it at that. We have differences of opinion, and this is what makes our democracy function. However, the heart of the issue here is, what do we stand for as a council? We stand for vulnerable people in the community. We stand for the health and well-being of our children in our community, and we stand for those in need of representation and advocacy. Let's not forget, state schools are under more stress than ever before. They need all the help they can get, not only for themselves, but more importantly to help the students who are experiencing bullying and some sort of discrimination purely because of their sexuality. I'll leave it there.
Thank you, Councillor Lee. The debate is now closed. I'll put that to a vote. All those in favour? Those against? That item is carried.
Call division.
Division has been called. I call all those who voted to support the motion to stand up, please. I know Councillor Lee, McCarthy, Williams, Cetus, Fontana, Lawrence, Villela. Those against, please stand up. I know Councillor Walsh. Thank you. Next item we're considering is our 6.4, update on Green Street pedestrian path.
Mr Mayor, I'd like to move an alternative to the recommendation, and I've just received advice from residents who are active on this issue, and councillors may have had contact with these residents in the past as well. I'll read the alternative motion if you can bear with me. It's just got 3 points to it. It is that Council, 1, notes this report on the Green Street pedestrian path, which is as read. 2, notes that $300,000 has been included in the 2016-17 Council budget for state and local active transport partnerships to enable co-funding for such projects. And 3, writes to the Minister for Public Transport and local MPs, both houses, requesting that the government also contribute to the cost of this path.
Second.
Secondly, Councillor Sidis, and that needs to be circulated,
we've circulated.
to the minute takers for
Certainly
recording.
will, and I'll give an explanation, and thank you very much for your consideration, and Councillor Sidis for that support. Councillors, and I appreciate this was deferred from the previous meeting. I'd requested that it could be because there had been a request to the member for Northcote and to the Minister, as councillors would have read in the report, and of course to government agencies as well, for co-contribution to this path. And our officers have done a good job in following through on some advocacy on that front, and the community has done an exceptional amount of work in advocating directly to agencies, to the Minister, and at one stage I would point out that we had different messages coming from the Minister and from VicTrack and I think it's MTM they're now called, one saying we could go ahead and another saying we couldn't go ahead. Where we've gotten to now, as you can see, is that we are getting closer to a licence agreement for use of the land, and therefore that clears the path for council to put in a formal pedestrian path, which is not unlike what we already have at the other end, I believe, extending to Westgarth Station, which I'm sure Councillor Sidis will touch on. The critical thing here is that in our original motion we requested a co-contribution from the government towards this project, and that's not an unreasonable request because it is on their land, and council of course has put money in its budget under a specific item called local and state active transport partnerships. The idea here is that we go in together with the state government when we identify an area, and in this case it is on the principal walking map, I believe, and also is a well-loved and well-used path. Thankfully we have had some progress. There are still a couple of hurdles, including MTM approval, but I'd like to think that a state government that has made some good commitments and some strong commitments to active transport, including a $100 million active transport fund, would be able to make a small contribution to this because it is on state land. If it's not on state land, then I'd like to think that we would get an extended lease agreement, certainly at stronger terms than what we're currently being offered. So we are in a negotiation process. We do have money in our budget, but it would be great to see that commitment that we got from the Public Transport Minister follow through with some dollars on the table as well. And that might be 50-50, it might be some other arrangement. But if we don't ask, then they won't necessarily be in a position to put forward money. I wouldn't expect we'd get contributions from those agencies, but I'd like to think the Minister might be able to provide some direction on that front. I'd also point out that this particular path actually enables residents in that pocket to avoid a long and circuitous route around several other streets to get back to their residences when they're coming back from the station. So if we do want people to catch the train, we've got to make it easy for them to get there. It's a simple thing. So I thank you for councillors for bearing with me on that point.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Sidis, anything to add?
Yes, Mr Mayor. The memory dims a little bit, and I did make reference to this when we deferred it the last time around, and Councillor McCarthy mentioned, of course, me speaking about the other end or essentially from I think it's Knoll Street back to Westgarth Station on the city side, that a gravel path had been installed. But what I don't understand is what our involvement in that was. Did we actually spend any money? And so before we rush, I think, to make any contribution, it is worth noting in terms of how intensive our involvement may yet be. Because if you know that path, it's not like as if we're disturbing any infrastructure that perhaps may yet to be taken up in terms of looking at any installations that might be underground. So I would look at a more sort of a liberal approach in terms of suggesting that if it's not sensitive, if it doesn't have any mains or any water or any power installations that run underground in there, then it seems to be quite a low investment opportunity for us in terms of making a dedicated path, similar to what's there now. So in this instance, the convenience factor that Councillor McCarthy mentioned is not the way it looks. It's only because it's a shortcut. People who used it during winter ordinarily used to march through a bog, Mr Mayor. So what we're talking about is actually lining that pathway. Interesting enough, cyclone fence is there to stop people crossing the railway tracks. So in terms of securing a dedicated path, it's not too hard to then just gravel the whole thing without having to necessarily look at things like concrete.
Thank you, Councillor Sidis. If there's no further debate, I'll put that to a vote. All those in favour? That item is carried. Thank you, councillors. The next item is 6.5, instrument of appointment and authorisation to appoint authorised officers. Move, councillor
Seconded.
Lawrence, seconded, councillor Walsh. Anything to speak to, councillor Walsh?
Just briefly, Mr Mayor, obviously this is just a routine delegation. For the sake of the audience and councillors are familiar with this, for the sake of the audience, the council operates under the Local Government Act, but council also is a statutory planning authority, and we delegate our authority as the council to the planning committee and to officers to deal with various matters, including planning assessments and planning enforcement. And this item is regularly done at the beginning of the year. This is an additional one to add in an extra staff member in relation to the Planning Act.
Thank you, councillor Lawrence. Councillor Walsh?
Nothing further to add. It's, as Councillor Owen said, it's fairly procedural and part of what we are required to do as councillors.
Thank you, councillor Walsh. I'll put that item to a vote. All those in favour? That item is carried. Thank you, councillors. We now go to item 7, consideration of responses to notices of motion in general business, commencing with the first one, 7.1, Vision Super's investments in fossil fuel and associated industries.
Happy to move.
Second, councillor McCarthy. Second, councillor Sears. Councillor McCarthy, all yours.
I love the enthusiasm.
Well, I seconded last time.
No, thank you, Councillor Seeders.
Albeit backhandedly.
What we have here, councillors, here are the responses to questions that have been put to Vision Super as a result of a notice of motion that I raised at a previous meeting. And councillors may recall that Vision Super is the super company that holds superannuation funds. Sorry, the superannuation fund that holds accounts for many of our staff and, of course, many local government workers across the sector. And there has been a strong campaign through a number of organisations, including Market Forces, which is an offshoot of Friends of the Earth, to look at divestment in super funds and to see super funds invest instead in job-rich industries, particularly in the renewable sector, which is part of the emerging clean economy that where we expect to see the majority of new manufacturing jobs rather than fossil fuel industries, which in fact tend to deliver very few jobs. So and it's not, of course, only about jobs, it's also about our environmental responsibility, and of course it's also about making sure that our staff, who I think we'd be confident have strong values about sustainability, are able to see their money go to the right places and not the wrong places. The response from Vision Super, to be frank, I think is actually a bit, whilst there's a lot of detail here, it says a lot about what hasn't happened on their watch and in their business. And if there's one thing that's come out of this campaign, and councils like Darebin, Yarra, Moreland and elsewhere signing on and in fact writing directly to Vision Super, it's to force them to take a good hard look at themselves. I think they need to take a bit more of a look at themselves, but that's a matter for another day. They have made some commitments here to review their current holdings, and in the letters that they wrote to councillors, they made a point of saying that they were looking to reintroduce their ethical investment option for members. That's not what we're asking them to do. We're asking them, in fact, to divest from polluting industries rather than giving members an option to switch. It's a little bit like saying, would you like the fossil fuel drink or the non-fossil fuel drink, and charging more for the non-one in a way. So there's a disincentive here, it makes it harder, and yet there are fossil fuel superannuation funds operating and thriving in the Australian market right now, so it's in their interests to make the switch. I won't go on too much, it's in the report there. This is really for us to note. And as councillors would see, there are no direct implications to council's own work, but our reputation in terms of being a strong pro-climate change action council follows through to our advocacy to these sorts of organisations which we do business with by virtue of paying to the super fund on behalf of our staff. So I'm pleased the amount of work that's gone into this by our officers, and I think that council officers who have funds with Vision Super, I think will appreciate this as well. So I'd just like to thank our officers for the work on that front.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Seeders.
Thanks, Mr Mayor. And I think Councillor McCarthy has touched on the right themes. In fact, they're my very own. Particularly I reflect when I did business ethics and sustainability as a subject last year. A lot of this corporate floweriness is littered in the academic literature, and sadly, the rate of doing it, as opposed to saying that they're going to do it, is there for all to see in terms of the numbers. But to give them a little bit of a cop-out, a little bit of a compliment, if you look at page 29, towards the bottom there, it does talk about their investments in wind farms. Now, what's interesting in terms of the timing of this response, and also in terms of the Premier's announcement just the other day, in terms of striving for carbon neutrality by 2050, is in relation to large-scale environmental sustainability developments, particularly wind farms. Now, there's an opportunity in which tangible investment opportunities lie for big super funds like Vision Super to tap into it. So if the market signal is there by government, surely then the investment dollars will follow. And I think that's got to be the way to go. Because without the government, Mr Mayor, actually putting those market signals out there, it doesn't give a driver for the private sector, let alone for the super funds, to move away from lazy investments. Let's put it that way. Or conventional investments. So the point being is that until such time as we get to that point, you'll see aspirational targets littered in the literature with very little realisations coming out of it in terms of outputs. I suspect we're talking about mitigation here rather than divestment. I think that's the operative word in terms of practice, Mr Mayor. I still feel we're a mile away from actually seeing a circumstance in which any credible company will be able to put hand on their heart that they've actually divested themselves from fossil fuels.
Thank you, Councillor Curtis. There's no further comment from councillors. I'll put that to a vote. All those in favour? That item is carried. Thank you, councillors. Next item.
I'd just like to have that noted as unanimous,
yes,
if I may.
As unanimous.
Thank you.
Minute takers. Thank you, councillor. Next item is 7.2, fossil fuel investments policy.
I'll move that as well.
Councillor McCarthy. Seconded, councillor Lee. Councillor McCarthy.
I think it might be tonight's the clearinghouse for all my motions, Mr Mayor. And thank you, Councillor Lee. This once again, a huge thank you to our officers for the work that's gone into this policy, and I had the opportunity to meet with one of our directors about how we do this, given the different approaches that have been taken at different councils. Originally, the notice of motion called for a strategy, and I think wisely we've got a policy here instead, which is the starting point. It commits us to the philosophical approach we wish to take, but it also acknowledges the constraints that currently exist. And that's been spoken about in this chamber before when it comes to councils divesting from fossil fuel financial institutions, or financial institutions that hold investments also in fossil fuel businesses and invest our money in their businesses. To give council some context to this, and for the gallery as well, as of the second quarter of this current financial year, so December 2015, we had around $54 million sitting in councils' bank accounts. That is ratepayers' money sitting in reserves that is waiting to be spent on the items that are in our budget, and some of its reserves as well. That's a lot of money, $54 million, and we'd like to think that it's going into things that are aligned with our values as a council, and ideally into, as we've talked about before, the jobs-rich industries that create jobs for local people, including young people as well. We also have an investments policy that we need to operate within, and it's a requirement of the Local Government Act, and there are very specific requirements that are outlined in the policy and in the report regarding who we can and can't bank with. And this is one of the major constraints that we operate within, and we need to see a change, obviously, in the Act, but also a change in the ruling from the Department of Treasury and Finance regarding who we can hold bank accounts with, because there are restrictions to the credit rating of those banks. Whilst some of the organisations, including Market Forces, which is listed there, have undertaken extensive research into the financial credibility of various banks and institutions and their fossil fuel divestment, not all of them are eligible for local government to put our money with them. And so we have to be choosy, unfortunately. What the policy does is that it pushes us towards the next stage, and as you'll see under future actions, it says nil there. That is because the next stage of investment must be done through this lens. If we can find a fossil fuel institution, an institution that does not hold any money in fossil fuel industries, and we can put money in with them and guarantee the same rate of return, an equivalent rate of return within, I think it's 0.5 percentage point, then we'll put our money there. So it's a good move. It exists within the current financial framework we must operate in. It means that we get a good financial return, but we're moving in the direction of divestment in as much as we can at the moment. So I thank our officers for their work on that.
Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Lee, anything to add a second?
Just very briefly, as Councillor McCarthy has covered most of it, but I think it's important to acknowledge that given the constraint of the environment in which we're operating in, our officers have done a tremendous amount of work in this area. But more importantly, what we're doing here is sending a signal out to the market, if you will, to say we're actually actively looking into this space. And once we get sufficient critical mass on this issue with other councils, hopefully that will shape the investment market and perhaps even change the Act one day. We'll see.
Thank you, Councillor Lee. There's no Councillor Lawrence.
Just briefly, I'd just like to talk in support of this motion, and I think while it's noted the financial constraints we have, both our fiduciary duties plus the constraints under the Act, it's important that if we do get a better framework federally and state-wise in terms of renewable energies, then these investments will become competitive. So rather than sitting and waiting for that time, we do need to have the policy in place so that we're active to move into those new investments when they come on stream.
Thank you, Councillor Lawrence. There's no further speakers. I'll put that to a vote. All those in favour? That's carried. Unanimously noted, and can sign a document tomorrow. Okay. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much, Mr. CEO.
The next item of consideration is 7.3, Darebin's pop-up parks.
Happy to move it, Mr Mayor.
Move, Councillor Villala. Second to Councillor Lee. Councillor Villala, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Mr Mayor. This is, I think there are lessons to be learned with regards to pop-up parks that have popped up in the last... I couldn't help myself. I'm speaking in relation to the pop-up park in Broadway, and I'm assuming Councillor Lee probably talked to the pop-up park in Hanover Street, but
Oakover Road.
Oakover Road, sorry. But in relation to the pop-up park, in Broadway, I welcome the recommendation here, Mr Mayor, because the recommendation is that pop-up parks to be considered on an individual basis, and the parks would respond to master plan recommendations or community requests, but most importantly that they need to come, each proposal needs to come to council for endorsement before any installation. And I think that's really critical, Mr Mayor, because in relation to Broadway, that was not part of the citizens' jury recommendation, but part of the master plan, the reservoir master plan. And what happened, Mr Mayor, is that these master plans are developed and they're long term, and some people forget about the content, and then you wake up and you see a pop-up park in Broadway. Now, the problem that we had with that, Mr Mayor, is that it didn't come to council. We didn't have input into design. We didn't have any opportunity to critique it and to see whether the $93,000 that it cost ratepayers was actually appropriate at this particular point in time of the budget cycle. So I think that the lesson, and as a ward councillor, there was a lot of backlash as to the look of the park, the pop-up park, and the cost. When you have a look within the context, Mr Mayor, that the pavement along Broadway hadn't been addressed, and there are lots of other priority issues, I think, in the eyes of the community, and I think we really need to have a bit more control over the pop-up parks, and this recommendation allows for that. Secondly, I do agree that there was a safety issue around the Broadway where the public toilet is, and there was a public safety issue, and I understand that the pop-up park has gone some way to addressing that. However, I think that there are other ways that could have been addressed and maybe incorporated with a bit more accountability and input from the community. $93,000 is a lot of money, and we need to make sure that we go through all appropriate consultation and accountability. So I'm happy with this recommendation, and I think more importantly, the community would expect that from us.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Councillor.
Mr Mayor.
Councillor
Speak in
Lawrence.
opposition.
Hang on, second has got a right to speak first. Councillor Lee.
Yes,
I'm
thank
just
you.
letting them know.
That's fine.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Yes, I'll talk very briefly about the pop-up park that happened at the junction, which was subject to a fair bit of coverage in the local press. You'll note on the page 39 of the report that out of the money that was expended, 75% of that were actually expended on reusable elements. They were on trees, which were later planted on reserves. They were planted, and all the understory planting, the shrubs were also planted. The crushed rock, the soil, they were reused. The remainder 25% were one-off costs, such as the design elements and installation costs, the labour that's associated with it. So the pop-up parks were designed to test the concept, and in the junction area at least, with the one I'm familiar with, that had generated some community response which were in the positive. More particularly, they see the closure of the slip lane turning from High Street onto Alcover Road. They saw that as a very positive element of that pop-up park, and as a result of that, there was actually a community petition urging for the ongoing closure of that, and I thank the council for voting in agreement with that to have that permanently closed. So we do examine that in a more permanent use of that space. Well, we already had been approached by a community group, Transition Darebin have spoken to me, and they said they want to hold perhaps one of their food swaps there, given this visible location and its close proximity to public transport. So those pop-up parks are expensive, but 75% of them are reusable, and they do generate community interest. And when communities see councils reclaiming land for public use, they get a buzz out of it, and they want to use it, and they want to take part of it. So there are some lessons to be learned, but there are also some positive spin-offs as well.
Thank you very much, Councillor Lee. Any other speakers? Councillor Lawrence.
Speak in opposition to the motion. Yes, Mr Mayor, I note this report in response to, I think, notice a motion by myself and maybe other and petitions by community. I speak against the motion because I believe that we should just put an end to these pop-up parks. And there's a couple of simple reasons, and they're not just about rate capping. They're actually about our responsibility to seek best value for money and to green this city. Now, I was very happy to introduce and be supported by Council for $350,000 to introduce the urban forest in Darebin. Somehow, that program has been diverted, cut and shredded, and we've been caught up on trendy ideas, which are fantastic in the City of Melbourne, where they've got cash to burn, and San Francisco, but we have hundreds and hundreds of hectares of public open space that is not properly landscaped, and our urban tree master plan, our urban forest plan, has lots of land but no budget. It's gone from $350,000 under this council to $200,000. We've got to drop the trendy fluff and actually concentrate on developing our parklands right through the city. And the residents in Broadway would have rather seen an extension of permanent grass and landscaping that exists there, and not an ugly, trendy, temporary waste of money.
Thank you, Councillor Lawrence.
That says my right of reply.
If there's no other speaker, Councillor McCarthy wants to speak.
Look, I'm just struck by the, I suppose, what I might consider the missing the point factor in this debate, which is that let's make a distinction between the money that was spent on street furniture, which I didn't find particularly appealing.
For or against?
I'm speaking in favour of the motion and of the recommendation as moved by Councillor Villela and Councillor Lee. And I suppose responding to some of the points by Councillor Lawrence as well in the process, let's make a distinction between the street furniture, which I don't think was attractive, and I don't think it was necessarily, and I think Councillor Villela made the point about design, with the action of actually using public space in a more productive and more effective way. And I think that's what, in the case of the Oakover Road slip lane, there's been no negative impact in terms of traffic movements. Our traffic engineers have said that very clearly, and they're quite comfortable with maintaining the slip lane, and we have a new urban space available to us. Now, maybe it might have been a better approach to have closed off the slip lane and put in some plantings, and dug some of that space out and put in some greenery there. I would have supported that 100%. That's not what came to council. What came to council was some mobile street furniture. In fact, it didn't come to council, but it was actually the project in itself. That's happened. let's move on. The point here is let's not make a false distinction between the street furniture and actually the idea of closing off some spaces to traffic and actually making them more vibrant urban spaces. And here we have an opportunity, as Councillor Lee mentioned just before, for a potential food swap area in an area that has a lot of apartments, a gathering place for people that are, in some respects, a bit dislocated from each other in that junction area. And potentially in the future, the same thing could happen in Reservoir with the growth of apartment type living around Broadway and Edwards. So let's not miss the point here about what we're trying to do. It's about revitalising urban spaces, and that's what the recommendation as moved actually takes us
Thank you,
towards.
Councillor. If there's no further speaker, the mover has a right of rebuttal. Right.
Thank you. Just in response to the arguments against, I think it's really dangerous and a bit of an overreaction, Mr. Mayor, to make a blanket. We're going to put a freeze and prohibit any pop-up parks across Darebin. I think that's unwise. I think it's not necessary. The reason why I support the recommendation, Mr. Mayor, is because it has to come to council. We've got to see it at council. We've got to debate it in the chamber to see whether it's appropriate for the area, the appropriate consultation. Let's have a look at the designs, and have a look at the entire context. The situation on Oakover is very different to Broadway, and I think, and therefore, I think it's unwise to have a blanket, prohibiting all pop-up parks. What I think the lesson learnt, and I'll repeat it, the lesson learnt is not enough accountability coming back to the chamber. I think there are some safety issues in Broadway. That may be something needed to be put there, but I don't think the pop-up park was appropriate, the right response, design-wise and everything else for Broadway. But it's case by case. Let's bring it into the chamber, let's be more accountable, and let's judge it on its merits based on the needs of the community and based on the overall objectives of that particular area. They're all different. We need to be flexible and accountable. Thank you, Mr.
very
Mayor.
much. To close the debate, I'll put that item to a vote. All those in favour of the recommendation? Those against? That's carried.
Call for a division.
All those in favour of the recommendation, please stand up. I name Councillor Lee, McCarthy, Fontana, Walsh and Villela. Those against? Councillor Williams, Cetus and Lawrence. Thank you, councillors. Next item we're looking at is our 7.4, the impact of the North East truck curfew on Darebin.
I've got an alternative which has been sent through to the officers, so it should
Let's have a look and see if it appears on the screen. So the first point is as per recommendation, and you've added point 2.
Point 2.
The councillors have a chance to read it. I don't think that was circulated to councillors today.
Secretary.
Steve's already seconded.
Could I ask?
Yes, Steve, but I'm happy to do
Ray,
it.
Question?
for amendment.
Councillor McCarthy has circulated this, seconded by Councillor Cetus. Councillor Lawrence.
I'd seek an amendment. I can write it out properly. That the third point, that we get a report back to council on those routes that have been affected with high levels of residential dwellings around them, so that we get a detailed report comparing to the Rosanna Road situation.
Can we get that in writing?
I'm
I think
happy.
we understand.
The spirit.
Let's put it down.
Happy to take
A further report.
Right. Councillor Lawrence will write that out. Yep. It's been accepted by the move and seconded. Councillor McCarthy.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor, and apologies, councillors. I don't know if this was circulated beforehand, but it's quite clear. It's simply to add an action based on the alarming figures that are included in this report. And I draw councillors' attention to page 46. I had the strange experience of being invited to be on this community reference group for this truck curfew after applying to be on the community reference group. It turns out no Darebin resident, despite some applying, was actually allowed onto it. Almost all the residents that are on the Vic Roads Truck Curfew Reference Group live along Rosanna Road or the surrounds. They're the people that directly benefit from the ban itself. No one from surrounding areas that have the flow-on impacts has actually been invited on, but thankfully one of our officers and myself both were invited, I think with 2 days' notice for the meeting, so I couldn't attend. So something interesting is going on there, but I won't go further on that point. I just draw councillors' attention to what's taken place, and of course councillors may recall that this was a pre-election pledge by the member for Ivanhoe in response to some community concern to introduce a truck ban, a nighttime truck curfew from 10 p.m. to 6 a.m. That has been implemented. It's in a trial program at the moment, and as councillors would see on page 46, this report outlines the impact on Darebin's roads as a result of that truck curfew being implemented. And the roads that are listed there under Table 1 are Darebin's roads, and you can see as you look across the table, the very last column, the percentage change in truck movements on our roads. We've got figures as high as 47, 45, 41 and 43%. These are alarming increases when you consider those roads, the truck volumes that were already there, and in one case, for instance, south of Westgarth Street and High Street, an extra 46 trucks might not seem like a lot, but let's talk about the kinds of trucks we're talking about and the routes that they're going on. This is an increase in truck traffic, not just on this one night when the survey was taken, but on a constant basis. So I have seen this. Residents have reported it to me along Grange Road and of course along Darebin Road as well. And as we can see, this extends all the way through the city of Darebin. The worst increases, of course, in the north of Darebin, south of Monies Road in High Street there, where we have almost a doubling, in fact 137 to 202. That's an extra 65 trucks coming along that corridor along High Street. And that is a huge increase. And when we asked at the time whether this would result in such an impact, we were told, yes, it may, but nothing significant. We can now see the significance of it. So point 2 is essentially to take this message to the Minister and to local members. We do have the benefit of the multi-party upper house in the Northern Metropolitan area, and I'd like to think that at least one of those members will take up this issue. But importantly, if they're going to continue on with this truck ban, then they should be extending it to other inner city areas.
Thank you. Second, I wish to reserve your right. Thank you. Any other speakers? Councillor
I'll just speak for the motion and limit my comments to the amendment. I'd just draw people's attention to the map on page 45. The increased traffic, and obviously Rosanna Road had particular concerns and a particular congested bottleneck, and this issue about the missing link that people are cutting through to the Metro Ring Road trucks at night. Now, the displacement on these roads, of these truck volumes are obviously there on Ring Road, Cheddar Road, High Street and Bell Street in particular. Now, why I've asked for a further report is that I think we need to do some more analysis here than simply say we protest. We need to actually look at the analysis of these roads, particularly Cheddar Road, and it's residential in nature. Also, even High Street in parts is quite residential in nature, and do some detailed, get a detailed report back to do some comparative analysis about the residential amenities that's been protected in Rosanna Road and whether those conditions exist on some of these roads for us to argue. So I'm not here, I suppose, saying I want to see truck curfews throughout Darebin, but I think if we get the data back, we may be able to ask that certain routes also be considered for curfews.
Thank you, Councillor Lyons. Any other speakers? Councillor Walsh.
Thanks, Mr. Mayor. Look, I think that this Councillor Lawrence's amendment is certainly a worthy amendment, and because we do want to find out, the exact roads which Darebin could potentially ask for, because if it is happening on in Rosanna Road, a road that's so close to us, and even there, it's not necessarily all that popular even with their local residents, which is surprising. But be that as it may, it's I think it's probably only natural that we would face a foreign effect into Darebin, and the fact that when this happened, we as a local council and a local authority were not consulted is concerning. I think we should probably express concern to the now state government about this. But yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Thank you very much. There's no further comment or debate. I'll put that to a vote. All those in favour? That's carried. Thank you, councillors. That concludes our responses to notice of motion. We now go to notice of motion, item 8. First, 8.1, the M40 project, fast tracking of closure of non-signalised road. Move Councillor Lee, second to Councillor McCarthy. Councillor Lee.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, Councillor McCarthy. Council will be very much aware of the M40 project, the replacement of the pipeline along St George's Road median shared path. We know that the project has been gone through several rounds of consultation, and we know that it's generated an enormous amount of community interest among various interest groups, and I know there's been some extensive lobbying done both to the council but also to our state MPs. And I must state here for the record, I wish to thank the efforts of the member for Northcote for all her hard work on this issue, because I know she has been subject to extensive consultation with various interest groups, and she has done an enormous amount of work behind the scenes on this. What we have, councillors, is that we have roughly about 85% of the project locked down. We know that where it's going to start, how it's going to go, where the traffic is going to go, in terms of the bike traffic and the pedestrian traffic, and also the trees, saving of the trees. What we don't have is that missing 15%. And that missing 15% I'm referring to is the temporary closure of the non-signalised crossing along the shared path. At this current state of play, we'll temporarily close it, and then once the project is finished, we'll reopen it with a view to to a permanent closure there afterwards. So what the motion seeks to do is essentially to fast track the process. Why do you take that process twice when you can do it once and do it right? So this is what this notice of motion seeks to do. It seeks to do that remaining 15% of the project that is known to us, that is consistent with our vision along that St George's Road shared path. We do need to convince Vic Roads and the Minister for Roads to fast track the process, so we're not disadvantaging communities by temporarily closing it, only to reopen it and then permanently closing it. To me, that's a waste of resources. I'm sure Council will agree on that. My last point is really we need to host one or more workshops in order to update and inform our community members, because there are quite a lot of misinformation, people working on assumptions and outdated information, and I think as a local community, we need to, as an elected representative, we need to inform our community, bearing in mind it is not our project. However, we have a responsibility to ensure the most up-to-date and accurate information are conveyed to our community.
Thank you, Councillor Lee. Councillor McCarthy.
Thank you, Councillor Lee, for once again raising this. I think we've had several notices of motion by some of us on this matter, and I think 5 or 6 now, but we'll keep asking. We'll keep asking because we have been asking for this, in fact, since 2004.
September.
2014, I should say, not 2004. 2014. Some things have been long-term projects, like the reservoir grade separation. 2014 is when we first wrote to the state government and the Department of Treasury and Finance on this matter, as a result of our 2013 St George's Road safety audit, where we identified that these non-signalised crossings were one of the greatest risks to both vehicles, motorists, cyclists, the tram users and pedestrians. And in fact, Yarra Trams has expressed their strong support for this, because anyone who's tried to cross one of these non-signalised crossings knows that you play a dangerous game when you try to position yourself between the tram line and the cycle and pedestrian shared path there, and of course all the other kinds of activity that take place around there, which you're just not sure what's going to happen. So this requires obviously the closing of those crossings, but it also requires some rearrangement and re-engineering at the turning lanes to enable more vehicles to bank up so they don't block the St George's Road flow at those signalised crossings. Vic Roads can do this. They've done it elsewhere. You just need to look at the treatments in places like Dandenong. I think it's called Flinders Street there, or Collins Street, the main drag there, where you cannot turn in the middle of that section of road. They don't have a tram there, and yet they've managed to get a continuous break in the middle of the road. So it's achievable. Vic Roads needs to make the decision. The Minister, ideally, hopefully will hear this call and take action. And let's not waste taxpayers' and ratepayers' money doing the same thing twice.
Thank you, Councillor. Councillor Lawrence.
I've just got a question about what we're voting for. We're voting for the closure of how many crossovers?
I believe that's identified in the St George Road safety audit. I think it's the order about 4 or 5. I don't have the exact figures in front of me, but they're contained in the safety audit.
It's Gad Street is the worst one of the
southern part. The southern part of the city, South and Norby Avenue.
So just supplementary question. So including the U-turn crossovers?
It's technically still, yeah.
Yep.
Yeah, I believe so.
Yep.
It is worth noting, Mr Mayor, that it is our current position and it has been our advocacy for 2.5 years on
and
this.
it's been adopted by the council.
I'll just speak in opposition to this then, Mr Mayor.
You have 2 minutes.
Look, the council had conducted a safety audit of St George's Road, which looked at the high risk, medium risk and low risk crossover points along that stretch, and the conflicts between pedestrians, cyclists, cars, trams, and the occasional dog, whatever pet, is quite a lot, and it's quite hectic, those crossovers. However, that study report, which we quote, and I'm not sure if any people have read it, actually talked about consultation with the community about removing the high-risk ones as a priority and going back through that scale. Now, obviously, during the works itself, we'll experience complete separation, the kind of Berlin Wall of traffic will be there, and there won't be east-west movements. But why I ask this, because obviously it's an issue more about how we do consultation on this, is if our position is that all vehicle crossing points east-west are blocked, that's problematic. And again, I have a problem with voting for things on a few words here without all the data.
Thank you, Councillor Lawrence. We've actually been provided with some of the data. We might provide that again. Councillor Lee, if there's no other speaker, you may close the debate.
Thank you, Mr Mayor. I must find that Berlin Wall comment rather astonishing, because I don't know what we're trying to divide here.
Thank you, councillors.
All we're trying to do is provide safety to our pedestrians, safety to our cyclists, safety to our tram users, safety to other road users. If that's a form of Berlin Wall, then so be it. Let's be very clear. We've adopted unanimously the findings of the safety audit.
Yep.
And this is entirely consistent with our adopted policy.
It's what our community
Councillor Walsh, thank you. Councillor Lee.
We don't want to flip-flop because that puts our community at risk. We don't want to flip-flop because that wastes our ratepayers' money. If people want to flip-flop, they can do that, but I'm not prepared to do that.
Thank you, Councillor Lee. That closes the debate. I'll put that on to a vote. All those in favour? Those against? Carried.
Division, please.
Division call. All those in favour of the recommendation, can you please stand? I name Councillor Lee, McCarthy, Williams, Cetus, Fontana, Walsh, Balala. Those against? Councillor Lawrence. Thank you, councillors. That concludes item 8, notice of motion. We now go to item 9, urgent business. Do we have any urgent business, Mr CEO? That concludes item 9. Item 10, general business. Any general business lodged, Mr CEO? No. That concludes item 10. Item 11, any petitions from councillors this evening?
No.
There are no petitions. Thank you, councillors. Item 12, records of assemblies of councillors, as listed there, 12.1. Move Councillor Cetus, second to Councillor McCarthy. I'll put that to a vote. All those in favour? That's carried. That concludes item 12. Item 13, reports by mayors and councillors have been circulated during the course of today's proceedings and will be included in the next minutes. Move Councillor Walsh, second to Councillor Williams. I'll put that to a vote. All those in favour? That's carried. Item 14, consideration of reports considered confidential, Mr. Sir. We have no confidential reports this evening. brings us to the close of tonight's meeting.
Right.
Thank you, members of the government. That concludes tonight's meeting, and thank you for those at home watching and government officials as well. We hope to see you on the 18th of July. Thank you.
Thanks, Mr Mayor.